Well, welcome to another Walk and Talk, and I want to talk to you about something slightly different. You see, I want to talk about why I wrote to my MP recently about the budget and tax. You see, we sometimes, as Christians, talk about letter writing and petitions and that kind of thing, and we tend to specifically talk about that when it comes to the key, kind of the big ticket moral issues. When there's something going through Parliament to do with euthanasia or abortion, and sometimes we might talk about things like free speech and human rights, and we may even have written on things, humanitarian issues like asylum, immigration stuff. And then, of course, sort of linked into that, we may pick up on things like the human rights of Christians and persecution around the world. So just this weekend, I wrote to my MP, I also wrote to the leader of the opposition about what is happening in Nigeria and the reported genocide of Christians, believers there. Those are good things to write about, but I want to suggest that they shouldn't be the only things that get us interested in what is happening in terms of politics in the country. Of course, moral issues matter to Christians. Of course, human rights issues matter. But there are other aspects of life as well, and what it means to not just because we are citizens anyway, so you could just write this in any capacity, but what it means as Christians to be concerned about what is happening. A little while back I wrote about whether or not we should have a theology, a Christian perspective on what is happening in my city here that I'm walking through right now, the city of Birmingham, in terms of a bankrupt council and bin strikes and all those kinds of things. But let me take you into my thinking. Why did I write to my MP about tax cuts? And that will help us think about how we approach these sort of wider issues of public life as Christians. So first of all, I wrote because there's a lot of reporting, a lot of rumours, a lot of speculation going on about the upcoming budget, which will be on the 26th of November. And the big speculation is that the Chancellor is likely to raise income tax. That may raise other taxes as well, but that's certainly the big one. Now, I personally, in terms of my political convictions, in terms of my understanding of economics, believe that would be a bad decision. So let me explain why I think that. So first of all, if we put up income tax at the moment, that's going to happen right in the middle of one of the longest squeezes on people's incomes. So that's come because for quite a long time, particularly due to austerity measures, we've not seen wages rise. And that was okay when inflation was low. But in the last 5 or 6 years particularly, we have seen a return to that age-old challenge of inflation as costs rise. And it rose significantly. It was up around 10-11% a couple of years back, I think, particularly reflecting some of the fallout from how Brexit was implemented, but also really exacerbated by um, what was happening with the pandemic and how that affected people as well. So, inflation puts costs up. Low wage increases add to that squeeze. And what that means is, and whilst inflation came down significantly, went back more to the levels it had been before, it still was not as low as it had been. And what we've seen is in the last year, inflation has started to bounce back up again. So costs are rising more quickly still. And the government doesn't seem to have a plan to tackle that. It seems to hope it will just go away by itself. But what that means is that really, when you look back, we talk about it sometimes as a cost of living crisis, and what that means is a lot of people have found life tight, and they found that they've been struggling, that they have been becoming poorer year on year, less well off. And so there's the personal impact on many people that we should care about, have compassion for. And alongside that, there are the wider economic implications. We have a society now where if people's incomes are being squeezed, and if interest rates are low, that there isn't also there's a stick here and a lack of carrot, if you like, which means people are less likely to save, they're more likely to get into debt. Secondly, if you are increasing tax on income, that's a disincentive to work. And thirdly, if people are less well off, if their incomes are being squeezed, it means that they have got less to spend. So that is going to have an effect on economic growth as well. The other side of things in terms of economics and fiscal policy is that there's this well-known effect that some people may consider counterintuitive, that actually if you put taxes up, if that gives a disincentive for people to work, if that actually shrinks the economy, then you actually get less tax revenue. So cutting taxes that encourages people into the economy, actually, if that leads to economic growth, is likely to increase tax revenue as well. So I disagree in terms of the personal impact on people. I disagree in terms of the economics of it. And also, I would personally argue that there are some moral questions around how we view and approach tax as well, which essentially is the dividing line between, is this the government's money that they have the right to just take from people because it's theirs, and so is a tax cut giving people money, and a tax increase simply the government holding on to stuff that it's entitled to. Or do we think of their income as being their income for them and their families and for them to choose how they spend it? Because if it's the latter, a tax cut is not giving people something. It's not a giveaway. It is giving them back what is really already there, what they've worked for. And a tax increase is taking something from people. That therefore needs significant justification. And there are all kinds of questions around that, big philosophical questions, as well as economic ones, about the morality of government, how government is meant to function, and what government is meant to be responsible for. And there is a long, a proud tradition in terms of moral philosophy of arguing that government should be small, that it shouldn't become too big, that it should be limited in its role to protect people from something that becomes overburdening and tyrannical. And that's often associated with something called libertarianism. And just to let you know, that's where I lean in terms of my own political philosophy. Now, I've challenged some people in recent times because I think there's been an overemphasis on this, where this kind of view has been treated as the only Christian option. And some of these people that I've heard making sort of libertarian arguments, I've not been convinced that they fully understand the whole philosophy themselves. Maybe they've come to it fairly new, but they're still learning it. But it is worth being aware that those arguments and reasons that that thinking is there. And that's important because sometimes when you hear people talk about things like low tax and we might describe as sort of centre-right politics, there's a tendency to portray that as selfish and therefore immoral. So one of the reasons why I'm flagging this issue up is to help us just take that little step back and not be so quick to jump to the conclusion that a position is immoral. So one reason that I wrote is because I think we need a healthier debate about these things, because there hasn't really been a debate about it in our society. A healthier conversation about the roles, the role and responsibilities and the limits of government, and the benefits and the disbenefits of taxation. And within that, I would have lots of views about what has happened in the past 15 years. My take would be, and there'll be different views on this, and some people would argue that the response to the credit crunch shouldn't have been austerity. My view is that on one level I agree with that what became labelled as austerity was actually quite nasty and also very ineffective, because essentially what we saw was a government giving the appearance of making painful choices and making cuts, choices that were painful and hit people's lives hard. But actually didn't really address the underlying issues. So essentially, it was about reassuring the markets and reassuring those that set the credit ratings to enable the government to continue borrowing as cheaply as possible. So the underlying issues in terms of our addiction to debt as a society, in terms of the fact that our government doesn't just run a deficit each year, but is massively eye-wateringly in debt. Um, and that really never got changed or addressed, despite the pain. But having said that, this does lead me into the second issue, because one of the concepts I have here you're beginning to pick up is just the general need for honesty around public debate. So the other side of things is this, that whilst the big underlying issues were never addressed, actually things did stabilise. And the deficit, the famous national debt, the deficit was really brought into sort of normal constraints, normal limits. And the government was not, in a strict sense, balancing the books, but was getting as close to that as you might expect in the context. And then the pandemic came, and we had all sorts of government interventions, including furlough, and that whacked the deficit back up again and increased the government's debt as there were these massive financial interventions. There's also economic impact of lockdowns. I think the sense that was a sort of a suppression that then bounced back again fairly quickly. So the finances were destabilised again. And there was a returning to normality, including inflation being brought back under control, including the public finances being brought back in control. A wobble really with what happened with Liz Truss and some very short-term decisions that wobbled the markets that weren't actually brought into play and were fairly short-lived. Which meant that actually, I would argue that whilst things are not great economically, the hand that the current government inherited wasn't that bad. And so when they talk about the previous government crashing the economy and the public finances are in a far worse state and we're just discovering things another year in, I have huge questions about that, and I don't think that is healthy for public debate. And I'm not saying that as someone who thinks that the last government got it right. I'm saying that as someone who thinks that there are big questions about the claims that this current government are making. And so really what is happening is that claims are being made that we are seeking to put right what the last lot did wrong to the public finances, but really any tax and spend decisions now are choices that this government is making about its own political agenda, about the things that it wants to do. And it's fair to say that. It's fair to say that we believe that we need to invest X amount of money in healthcare, in education, in welfare benefits, in overseas aid, in defence, and all those kinds of things. Fair enough to say that that's what we want to do, and therefore we're asking you to give more in taxes towards that. But that needs to be honest and upfront so that people know the choices that they are making. And that's important, because whether or not you agree with me in terms of politics and economics, we can disagree on those things, and that's what makes it challenging for Christians to speak out and address issues wider than the big ticket moral issues, because we might have underpinning values about compassion and care for those in need, but that may work out in lots of disagreement and debate about the actual policies to do that, which is why I would say that yes, there's a sense in which Christianity, the gospel is, gospel living is political, but it's not party political, it's not tribal political. It's not about locking onto one political ideology. So anyway, you can disagree with me about the economics and the politics of those specific decisions, but I would suggest that we can still agree about how this debate should happen. And first of all, an agreement that there needs to be honesty, there needs to be integrity, there needs to be transparency here about the decisions. Secondly, I would argue that the way that this is happening, the rumours, the speculation, and the way that the government is playing the media at the moment, what it does is it increases anxiety for people. It has a horrendous impact on people's mental health. It makes people start to even make decisions in advance that may affect their family and their well-being. And that's not great at all. And I would hope that there would be some unity to say whether or not we think there should be tax rises, that actually allowing this kind of speculation up to the budget and saying some things but not other things and leaving some things unsaid and the nod and the wink is not a good way of governing, and bluntly not a moral way of governing. And the third big moral issue here, where we can agree and say there are some moral issues here, is a party goes into a general election, it makes commitments, and in that general election debate, actually the Conservatives at the time were pointing out and saying that when you look at the spending plans that Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves were committing to, that they would have to increase borrowing and put up taxes. And the Labour Party at the time insisted that no, they would not need to do that. And in fact made specific pledges that they would protect the pension triple lock, that they wouldn't put up income tax, they wouldn't put up VAT, all those kinds of things. And so now we see the situation, first of all, where they are beginning to indicate that they will need to put up taxes, that the gap is exactly the same amount that they were told it would be because of their choices, their commitments, that they denied it would be, and they are beginning to indicate that they might break that promise, that they might break trust. And that's the final reason why I think it is right not just to have an individual perspective on this, but to have a Christian perspective on this. To say that you shouldn't go into government with a light-hearted attitude to breaking promises. And so when I wrote to my MP, I asked them not to just hide behind that we've got to wait for the budget, but make it clear as an MP what is acceptable both in terms of what should be done, but also in terms of how we approach things. I think that's a reasonable thing to be raising with your MP. I think those are reasonable things to raise with MPs, but not just individually, but as Christians.